So 14. 14 is a controversial amendment even today. And again, it's the second of the Civil War amendments. The Congress of the United States guaranteed that 13, 14, and 15 were going to pass. And they guaranteed that they were going to pass by requiring the states that had been part of the Confederacy to ratify them to get back into the United States. So there was no question that 13, 14, and 15 were going to pass. Okay? So 14 says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction of our citizens of the United States, the state wherein they reside. States got to decide who their citizens were. States, not the federal government, prior to 14. Congress had the right to do it, but didn't. All persons born or naturalized, all persons, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That means that if you're the British ambassador, your kid is, because you have diplomatic immunity, you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Your kid's not a citizen. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to are citizens of the United States and of the state. All of the slaves, basically in the South, were not citizens. Their states did not count them as citizens. If they were citizens, then the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th Amendments applied to them, and they were basically free men and women and children, because you can't do to them all the things, right? They have rights. Well, if they're not citizens, they don't have rights. How do we make sure they're citizens? All persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. That is fundamental protection for the former slaves lived in the South whose states simply were preventing them from being citizens and therefore for enjoying the rights of citizens of the United States. Okay? So all persons born or naturalized are citizens. Now, today, of course, this has become controversial because we have tour groups of Russians who come to the United States, stay at golf resorts on the East Coast when the female of the couple is 8 months pregnant. They stay for 3 months at golf resorts in the eastern part of the United States. They have a baby while they are golfing at the golf resort. And then they get back on a plane after they've acquired the U.S. passport for their little baby, and they fly back and they go to Russia. Now their child has dual citizenship. Their child is a Russian citizen and an American citizen. And when their kid gets old enough, their kid can move to the United States and take mom and dad with them. Okay? So it's not just people coming across the southern border. It's every border of the United States. There's actually a whole tourism industry built around U.S. citizenship. Okay? Should we change that? I don't know. But that's why we understand now, hopefully, why it's there. It's there because of slavery and making sure the slaves have rights. The former slaves have rights. Now it's being used in a different way. Then it says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. So you can't single out. No state, okay, shall deprive any person. That means that 14 takes the Bill of Rights and extends it to the states. So no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunity of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, the reason I emphasize the word person is person. Okay? Why don't we shut down the prison we have at Guantanamo Bay and bring the terrorists or alleged terrorists at Guantanamo into the United States? Well, the answer is they are persons. And as soon as we bring them into the actual United States, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or process without due process of law, or deny to any person with the equal protection of the laws. Person. So once you bring those folks into the United States, even though they're not citizens, they're entitled to every right, privilege that you and I are, who are citizens. Okay? Same thing with undocumented folks who come across the southern border. The Constitution says person. So once they're in the United States, they're entitled to the normal due process of law and equal protection under the laws. So every law applies to them equally as it applies to every citizen. And that's what the 14th says. This is about protecting the former slaves, but now it has much broader meaning within our society. You look at things like DACA, and the DACA kids, who most of them are doing wonderful things and we should keep in the United States, right? We have legal and illegal folks who come to the United States and go to college and do really well and are going to become doctors and scientists. And do we want to just throw those people out? So we have this whole debate, right? There's so many people that I've known as students coming up that should just be able to stay here. They want to stay here. We should want them to stay here. They're great people. We should want them to stay here. So this whole thing about who's a citizen and how you treat people who aren't, the slavery laws are applying, which aren't intended to apply that way, and so there's always going to be confusion and problems. And I don't know what the answer is, right? I'm glad I don't have to make those decisions. But what I know is persons are entitled to equal protection under the law. All persons inside the United States are entitled to due process and equal protection under the law. And most of us are grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants. Most of the people who live in the United States have grandparents or great-grandparents who are immigrants. So it's a difficult question and a difficult issue. My great-grandparents and some of my grandparents came over here from Eastern Europe. And we used to just make you a citizen if you wanted to be. Okay? What's the right rule here? I don't know, but I see that word person in there twice, tied to due process of law and equal protection under the law. Prior to the passage of the 14th Amendment, states got to decide who voted. Most states didn't care whether you were a citizen or not. If you lived in the state, you got to vote. If you were a male, some states even allowed females to vote, and we'll talk about that in a second. But 14 Part 2 says all male citizens at least 21 years old can vote. So it doesn't prohibit a state from letting women vote. It doesn't prohibit a state from having 18-year-olds vote. But you know that if you're male and at least 21, you could vote. And it didn't matter what race you are. As long as you were male and 21 or older, you had the right to vote. And if they don't do that, the state loses representatives in Congress proportional to the number of people that they're refusing to let vote. So it's a very severe penalty if the state doesn't follow that. Okay? It turns out that they cheated, but we'll get back to that. Parts 3 and 4 of 14 say, if you were a traitor, if you were someone who was in the U.S. military and then you went into the Confederate Army, and you can think of lots of people who did this, you were in the U.S. military and you went into the Confederate Army, or you were a senator of the United States and you became the president of the Confederacy, if you swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States and then you were a traitor and you defied that oath, you cannot ever again in your life hold public office in the United States. And then it says that all debts that were racked up by the Confederacy are not valid and you don't have to pay them. Okay? So, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. You can't deny black folks the right to vote. You can't deny former slaves the right to vote. States did this repeatedly. Still, states are taken to court all the time, having been accused of this. You know that in the Georgia governor's race in the last election, the guy who was in charge of the election bureau was one of the candidates for governor. He didn't recuse himself from being the head of his department. He threw out about 70,000 voters, most of whom were probably covered in this amendment. He threw them out and they didn't get to vote. It's pretty interesting story for 2019 that this stuff still goes on. So there used to be there were states where they had a reading test before you could vote, and white people would get the local newspaper and black folks would get a newspaper printed in Beijing and not be allowed to vote because they couldn't read Chinese, where white folks got to vote because they could read English. So it's, even though we have this amendment, it doesn't mean that it's been followed very well over the years. All right, more stuff to come here.